Hi, my name is Kevin and I collect old irons. I found this iron in a shop recently, and this is a product of the Monitor Sat Iron Company of Big Prairie, Ohio. This is a latter version of a very common gasoline iron. It was put out in 1903, and the company stayed in business for more than 50 years. There must be a story in that, and indeed there is. Our story begins, as it must, with an inventor. John C. Lake was a veteran of the American Civil War, served in the 16th Ohio, wounded and discharged in 1863. We know very little about what John was doing the next 40 years, but in 1903 he was awarded this patent. He had some other patents in the 1880s, but this was, to my knowledge, the only iron patent that he ever got. This iron made him a wealthy man. Iron collectors are quite familiar with this company, as this is the most common of the early gasoline irons. The Monitor Sat Iron Company came from Big Prairie, Ohio, then is now a small unincorporated town in rural Ohio, south of Akron. Population's about 125, although the company is not listed in any of the several census reports that I looked through from the early 1900s. John Lake was a very big fish in a very small pond. There were a variety of other manufacturers of liquid fuel irons at this time. This is the Jubilee from 1899. This is the Ideal from 1901. What these irons had in common was that you could take the top off, and then once taking that off, you could take the insides out, and you could then fire this up, and once it was going as you wanted it to be doing, you could put that back in here, put this in, and you were ready to go. These companies were not overly successful, and consequently these two irons and others of that period are now quite uncommon. But the 1903 Monitor was quite simple. Here are the parts, and the design continued in production for decades. There were, over that time, only subtle variations. You might note that this particular iron has some information on the shield, which is unusual in my experience. Let's take a look at this iron. The tank is at the front of the iron. The tank itself is cylindrical with just slightly squared rounded corners. The top has a hex nut, and with this fancy little wrench that would come with the iron, I could loosen that, take the top off, put white gasoline in. The handle itself is black. This is in a period when you could buy Model Ts in any color you wanted so long as it was black. The company prided itself in producing products that were simple, utilitarian, and economical. The top comes off. The insides come out. Let's just take a look at the base here. The base is very heavy, the sides are very thick, and the structure of this base is what gives this iron, the company, and Lake's other business enterprises their names. What does this remind you of? The Civil War ironclad USS Monitor. And we might remember that John was a Civil War veteran. The USS Monitor fought the CSS Virginia at Hampton Roads. That ship is, of course, better known as the Merrimack, but the Union media used the ship's name rather than the Confederate name. Here is a brochure for this iron, which reads, "Save half the time, half the labor, and all the worry of ironing day with the Monitor self-heating sat iron." And here is a small poster about the Monitor iron. 4 hours for 1 cent. The greatest labor saver. No dirt, no smoke, no walking. Heats the iron, not the house. Every iron guaranteed. 350,000 in use. 350,000 is a lot of irons. And here is the first page of an instruction guide for this iron. By this time, over 550,000 are in use. Wow. So how did this work? We're going to start one of these irons in the next video. We have in previous videos seen other inventors whose philosophy was to come out with something new each year, and so there are many types and varieties. But Lake's philosophy was, why take on the cost of retooling? I'm going to produce something that works very well, and we're going to produce it for lots of years. But there were some changes over time. Here is a 1925 patent that shows essentially the same iron. the patent details a bit of a change in the interior construction of the tank. This and three 1929 patents are by Bertus A. Lake, John's son, who after a quarter century thought there might be some need for improvements. By the 1920s, there's more competition from electrics and more modern gasoline companies such as the Coleman, which are using stamped metal rather than a heavy cast bottom. But the monitor sat iron and its developed versions were something that I think people were very comfortable with. And perhaps I should also say that this iron was made in an area that is Amish country. So this is the Monitor C that we started this video with. The tank is the same tank, cylindrical, squared corners, but it's moved to the back, not the front, which meant that you can now see the business end of the iron as it was doing its ironing. The base is cast, it's heavy. There are now knobs at the back to control the heating. The top here does not come off. And this says patent pending. The patents came out in 1929, so this is probably from the mid-1920s. And the tank has a different lid. It doesn't have that little hex nut on top. Instead, it has a more elaborate device. This used a pump. By the way, the Monitor pumps had a finger ring at the end, not the knob end used by Coleman and other companies. Again, a very simple design to cut costs. Here is a later version of the same iron. This has more streamlined sides. Note that this still has the 1903 style tank with the squared corners. So the Monitor name was still being made and marketed at least into the 1930s and maybe for all the rest of the history of the company. But at this point the story takes a twist. The Monitor Sat Iron Company had another name, the Royal Self-Heating Iron Company. I think this name was geared for the younger set who are no longer enticed by a name from the Civil War. This still has a tank in front, though a bit more rounded at the bottom, and is essentially the same design we have seen earlier, but there are colorful handles. Here is an advertisement in a 1920 magazine. Note that there are now 850,000 sales. That is a whole lot of irons, and I think that's just for this version with the tank in front, but this one is under the Royal name. This ad shows the 1903 design and is for potential distributors. It reads, free Royal window trim, counter displays, colored movie slides, and a 32-page book on Royal salesmanship. A pretty sophisticated operation. And by the way, if anyone has any pictures of these various materials, I'd be interested in having them. The Royal name, by the way, was named after the plant manager, Royal Kerr. To name your product after an employee was rather progressive. Royal also had an equivalent to the Monitor C, though it was called the D. Here is the nameplate with the three 1929 patents, which says that this iron is from the 1930s or maybe later. Here is one of the 1929 patents for this iron, also by Bertus, who seems to have taken over the general business at that time. John is still alive in the 1930s, but would be about 90 years old. So these are the two general styles that represent most of our story. The 1903 version with a tank in the front, the 1920s version with a tank in the back. Both styles were made in both Monitor and Royal nameplates. The Royals usually had colorful handles, the Monitors had black handles. I've looked at a variety of pictures on eBay and elsewhere, and by and large the Monitors had the flat bottom tanks and the Royals had more round bottom tanks, but not always so. These two versions may well have been marketed right up to the point when the factory closed in 1954. Here is a 1932 ad with a tank in the rear under the Royal name going head-to-head against the Coleman Company. And by this time the gasoline iron makers had pretty well narrowed down to just these two. Coleman was making irons until 1963. There were some less common irons. This is the Model 37 automatic. It has basically the 1903 tank with a nut top, no pump, but is at the back. The iron basically operated the same as the 1903 with the handle coming off, and then you'd start this and put the handle back on. And yet it is extraordinarily stylish for a Monitor product. I think that these were a new style, trying to compete with the 1930s, 1940s electric irons. So I think this is very late in the period. I have not seen any ads to confirm that. This is the Model 25 automatic and came from Australia, where the Royals were imported. This iron mentions the 1925 patents and patent pending, so this should be from the late 1920s. I have seen South American irons in very monitor Royal shapes, though with different company makers. So whether these are imported, licensed, or copied, these things did get around. Here is a 1932 ad in a wholesaler's catalog. The Model 25 had a base pointed at both ends, and thus that was different from all the other monitor irons. By the way, this is not the same Royal as you see in some of the earlier sat iron stands, which I think were intended for Mrs. Potts style irons. The Lake father and son also ran the Monitor Bank, the Monitor Water Company, and the Lakeland Beach Amusement Park in Big Prairie. These were built on the fortune made in selling monitor sat irons. This is a picture of the bank, which also had on the first floor the post office. The Monitor Sat Iron Company office was on the second floor. This was a small town. The Lake father and son both died in the 1930s and are buried with their spouses under a single tombstone. One of the things I learned when I do these videos is how much there's out there that I did not previously know about the Lakes, the inventors. I had never heard of them, and they are obviously very interesting people in the history of Big Prairie. And those discoveries are what make a hobby fulfilling. As always, thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and we will be doing more of these in the future.